Speaking of bright people, we have a panel for you. The topic is governance, which is the path to decentralization. Would like to welcome Moderator back to the stage, Mr. David Wachsman. Come on up. And grab a mic there, David. Or do it differently this time. I thought maybe you would go ahead and introduce your illustrious panelists, and I will make myself scarce.
Oh gosh, I've got quite a panel today. Thank you very much for that wonderful introduction. Ladies and gentlemen, we have probably the all-star team to talk about governance. And if you don't know, now you do, governance is perhaps the single greatest problem we have today in blockchain. Not that the year is too early, but simply that we haven't solved a really core problem. And in here to talk about that, well, we've got Arthur Breitman, co-founder of Tezos. We've got Jenna Zenk, CTO Melonport. We've got Emin professor at Cornell in IC3. And we've got Primavera Filippi, among other things, an adjunct professor, I believe, at Harvard Law School. So as I was saying, these are, and everyone has a microphone? Are we missing one? Excellent, good. So these are the experts on governance. And so we're going to have quite a wide-ranging conversation today, but let's get started with something very, very basic. What is governance? Primavera, do you want to start us off?
No, I don't want to start.
Nope, okay. Too big. Arthur?
Okay, so governance is a process that you use to make decisions about the use of a shared resource.
So it's literally a process to make decisions about how to use something that several parties have.
That's
it.
That's right, yeah. That's how I define it.
Okay, so that seems like a pretty basic concept. So why is it so hard for us to solve in the blockchain space?
Well, I think what happens is that most people don't realize that you have a shared resource in the blockchain space, because if you look at a blockchain and you have a bunch of addresses and coins, it feels very much that it's purely private property. Like everyone owns their own coins. It's very, very separate. So why is there anything in common to manage? But they are common parts. Some of these are security, and part of the idea of most blockchains is that you have some sort of inflationary mechanism to provide security. So that's a form of governance already. So in a Bitcoin blockchain, for example, when you have Bitcoins being created at every block, that's a form of governance because you use that to pay for common parts. But they are more beyond the security budget. There's innovation, which is important. There are technical decisions. So there's a whole lot of shared decisions which are important. And I think they've been overlooked because people look at this and only think that it's kind of like atomic, siloed property.
Well, you packed a whole lot into, I think, a couple sentences there that I think that I'd like to talk about a little bit more. So yes, certainly we can talk about Bitcoin's governance first. This is the first blockchain. Who would like to speak? Gun, could you speak a little bit about how Bitcoin's governance works?
Sure. I'd like to add on to what Arthur said about governance, though. So one of the biggest difficulties with blockchain governance is the fact that blockchains have to be decentralized, and that implies that there should be no built-in control centers. And what that has typically meant is that at the time of creation of a coin, the creator fixes for all time the entirety of the behaviors that that coin can exhibit. And changing that becomes very difficult. That becomes what's called a Schelling point, a point around which social consensus forms, and a point that becomes really, really, really difficult to affect any kind of change on. So what that then leads to is a situation where people just can't really even fathom changing anything whatsoever. They don't have a voice. The only way they can actually make themselves heard is to use the exit option. They fork. That's essentially the Bitcoin governance model to date. And the secondary difficulty, on top of everything Arthur said, is the fact that these protocols at the lowest technical levels are not very inclusive. If you look at the Bitcoin blockchain, it's about 19 miners who produce 99% of the blocks. That's it. That's the sum total of everybody in that system who actually gets to make a chicken scratch on the blockchain. Okay, so everybody else, you, me, actually I have a miner, but people without the miners, they have absolutely nothing to do with that chain. So That's really, or rather, they have absolutely no way of actually getting their preferences known to the other participants on that chain. So that's a real big problem, and that of course means that all the people who actually use the system, they have no way of expressing their preferences, and the ecosystem then gets divided between miners and users. And there is currently, again, going back to your question, there is currently a big schism between the Bitcoin users and some of their miners. I've never seen a community so hateful towards some of the core people who do their most important work.
Yes, I mean, it's the basic infrastructure. Bitcoin literally doesn't work without those miners successfully finding blocks and solving very challenging puzzles, essentially. But at the same time, you're right, we've certainly seen this schism. Moreover, we've seen a prevalence of hard forks. We've seen a number of them. Why did those happen? Was it because simply Bitcoin wasn't architected properly?
No, it's just a divergence of opinion. You have the people who are in a position to exert authority, the people who control the discussion forums, the people who control what they call the reference client, the single centralized entity, essentially, that defines the protocol. They had a difference of opinion with some of their community members who thought that certain use cases should be favored or protected, whereas those people decided other use cases should be favored, protected, and in fact subsidized with a certain weight subsidy. So that led to a fork. In essence, this is a complete, just textbook example of a failure of governance. They could not come to a social consensus. There was actually no mechanism to facilitate that, and there was no technical way of bringing those people together, and therefore they had to fork.
So is one of the challenges that I guess we need to overcome, how do we go and achieve some sort of consensus on these, to govern these shared resources, and do we need to create better systems for this? What are the types of systems that have been examined in Primavera thus far to improve upon the situation?
Well, there are not many. I guess up until now, forks are actually the standard way in which we decide how to upgrade a particular protocol. You have different stakeholders that might be given more power in order to decide, but most of at the lowest layer is always hashing power. In the end, it's the miners that will decide where to put the resources. In the case of proof of stake, it might you can provide mechanisms by which you have the token holder that will have more power in order to decide. There are systems which I'm sure Arthur will explain to actually incorporate ability to change specific rules incorporating within the protocol the possibility of changing the rule. But I think as a general rule, we can see the traditional way, which is just forking, which in some way has its elegance into it, in the sense that it's a very non-coercive way of experimenting, and people basically will choose which one is the reference that they like the most, and they will just use that one without actually imposing their decision on anyone else. So there is something interesting about the forking, but on the other hand, it's an exit strategy, so it completely bypassed the actual governance problem, which is how do we govern those forks? How do we actually decide what is the change that is proposed, which today is done in a very technocratic manner by the core dev. They are the ones that will provide the alternatives at the moment. And then the question of how do we ensure that there is a sufficient amount of people that there is a consensus around one particular implementation, because if everyone keeps forking, eventually then you lose the value and the security of the network. So the forking mechanism is interesting because of the future of non-coercion, but it can only happen when there is either a strong consensus because it is a technical upgrade, but then we encounter, especially when you have contentious fork, that there starts to be a split. And then how do we actually, the real question is no longer about the fork, is how do you govern and manage that particular decision as to where the fork should go. And the second one that I think is also a very interesting approach is, so the forking, the governance via fork is kind of the horizontal mechanism. So the idea is that we create alternatives, and then those alternatives will compete with each other, and then people will choose the one that fits their preferences. And then another mechanism, which is also interesting, is to actually rely on a vertical type of governance. So keeping the underlying protocol as this kind of constitutional thing that should be very, very like as immutable as possible, and that should involve very few governance questions, and bringing up the governance question at the higher layer. And so you create like those layer 2 applications. So in the Bitcoin, you have like Lightning Network and things like this. And in that case, instead of making competition between the different protocols of the blockchain, you can create competition at the different layers on top of the protocol. So those are two different approaches. Each one of their benefit and their drawback. But I think the governance by fork is a problem to the extent that unless like some very specific cases in which it's absolutely necessary, or where there is either whether there is a consensus that it's just a technical upgrade and everybody agrees, so it's not a contentious fork. But in the case of contentious fork, it should only be done on like very few cases because it's actually splitting the network. Whereas the layer 2 system of governance is more interesting when there is contentious, because then you can experiment at the assuming that it is actually possible to do it on the second layer.
So, I mean, thank you for that. That was an extraordinary definition, I think, of the various approaches that we have, and certainly, Arthur, we're going to be digging into quite a lot. But Jenna, Melonport believes in, I think, the principle-based approach that was discussed earlier. Can you describe kind of how that operates and kind of how, well, you expect, well, you want the Melon protocol to stay, but the Melonport itself will be irrelevant within a couple of years?
Yeah, sure. So just to bounce back on what you said, I totally second what she said on forking, which is it is one of the only options that we have, but it's already a great option, meaning that if you take governance as a way to make decisions on shared public infrastructure, it's already some amount of freedom that you have. You can exit, you can go into this kind of like parallel world. And just to make that clear, today, if you're in a state, a government state, you don't have the option to fork. So it's already an improvement over what we have today.
You mean in the real world?
Yeah, right now, if you disagree with what, I don't know, the French government is doing, I can't fork the government, right? Right, so if I disagree with what Ethereum is doing, I can decide to fork. Then it's a question of are some people going to follow me? In what amount? And I think it's already a great thing, just to be clear. But it's not enough, because when you fork, you are also losing this network effect, which is also something quite powerful in the blockchain world. So that's why we are trying to find better ways to decentralize, to govern our protocols and networks in a decentralized way. So now coming from Melonport, Melonport is an infrastructure, a public shared infrastructure for asset management on the Ethereum blockchain. And the vision is that my company has developed this protocol for 2 years, but we don't want to remain the sole maintainer and kind of like controller of that network. And we want that network to be decentralized and not to rely on our existence and our work to survive. The reason for that is because it's an infrastructure where people will be managing substantial amounts of assets. If we have control over that network, we could censor people that we don't like. We could change the rules on people who run their businesses on our protocol. So we don't want to fall into that. But also we believe that if we decentralize the protocol, we will end up with a much better protocol in the future. Because if there are many teams working on one network, then I believe that you will get a much better mix of ideas and visions and different perspectives. So that's also, I think, important in the decentralization kind of like movement, that we can get better things out of it.
So one of the challenges that comes from that theoretically is that if you're handing the keys over to someone else or a group of persons, are you maybe handing it over to bad actors when you yourself clearly have higher principles? So, who should, let's talk about this first. Who should have a voice? Who should have a voice in making decisions on something as technically complicated and as mission critical as basic infrastructure that we all share?
That's an excellent question, and that's a question that we've asked ourselves a lot. And I think in when you're trying to design any governance system, the very first question is, who are the different stakeholders in our ecosystem. So who is, in Melon, for instance, we have token holders. We have users who could be asset managers or investors. We have developers. We have teams building other projects on top of the protocol. So that's like a lot of stakeholders. And when you identify those different categories of stakeholders, the next question is, who do you want to be able to have a say in governance, and why? And that's where people can take different approaches. You might want to give power to people who hold your token. Right. You might not want to do that. We didn't want to do that. The approach that we took is to identify who were the most vulnerable group of stakeholder in our ecosystem, and to make sure that they are protected and they have a way to participate in the governance process. Although, as you said, it's also a very early and immature technology, and you need also technical expertise to be able to take informed decisions. So we made a mix of both.
So Arthur, among other things, you recently had a vote on Tezos.
Well, I would love to react to the shoot question
of course.
As well. So I think it's like, it's not a, the thing is like, it's not about who should have a voice. It's not a shoot question. The reason you're doing governance is that is from very pragmatic reasons. You need to make, you need to make decisions, but, the opposite, and I remember a prominent people in the Bitcoin space saying, well, in Bitcoin we don't need governance. We just we just look at what technical decision is best, and we take that. And the problem is that that does not specify the implementation by which you arrive to what is the best decision, and then you need governance around that. But the point of the point of governance is you want to make good decisions. You want to have a system that's technically good, and I don't say. If you had a ton of trade-offs, then it can become about like who do you represent as opposed to other people, and there are some trade-offs, but I think that most of the designs we have today are very far from the efficient frontier, and so by and large it's really about how do we make good decisions as opposed to like who has a right to make a decision. It's not about saying like, oh, here's a warm feeling, the warm fuzzy feeling of feelings that you're part of the decision, you matter. That's nice, but like that's not the ultimate goal. The ultimate goal is you want to have a system that's efficient, that's secure, and you want to push towards these values. So I would say that a project should basically have values that it care about, and then the point of the governance system is to try to enact those values, as opposed to trying to kind of pull these values from your user base.
Well, that's a very interesting thought, and I think you've changed the conversation a little bit. Goon, how do you react?
So one of the most interesting things I think that's coming out of what we've seen in Bitcoin is the fact that a coin, at least in my opinion and in many people's opinion who've looked at this critically, a coin must have a governance mechanism. For if you don't have a governance mechanism, if you fall back to what Arthur was saying about, this like Bitcoin doesn't need governance, etc., what you then have is the tyranny of structurelessness. So when humans are involved, there is no such thing as a structureless human organization. There's always going to be some structure. And if that structure isn't well defined, it's something that's happening behind the scenes. Some neckbeard or another is in charge. And it's not you. And you don't know who it is necessarily, and you have no way of affecting the change you need. Whereas if the actual structure is in place, if the coin provides a technical mechanism for you to make your voice known, then you have an actual defined process by which you know exactly how much power you have. So that's one of the key things that guided us when we were designing the Ava coin, where we want every stakeholder to be able to say something, and we want we want everybody to have absolutely no uncertainty that if there is social consensus, the system will find it and will operate and will move to that new social consensus point. It's not going to be at the behest of some core dev. There is no such thing in Ava, for example. I detest that phrase. Core dev is a centralized term. It doesn't belong in this community. There is no gatekeeper. There is no Themos. There is no moderator. There is no this and that. In essence, the mechanism should be there, and it should be as decentralized, as amenable to analysis as the rest of the decentralized coin you've got, or else you've got a joke on your hands.
Primavera?
Yeah, I just wanted to add also to what Arthur was saying, that I think that to go back to your first question, what is governance? I think governance is also about specifying specific rules that will hand power to a particular type of groups at the expense of another type of group. So governance is about deciding who has like decision power with regard to a particular sector. And I think that oftentimes, especially in the blockchain communities, we forget like to account for the people that are actually affected by the decision. So sometimes it might be much more efficient to actually have core dev or to have token holders or miners to actually make a particular decision, because it's very easy to identify those groups, and it's very easy to create a formalized on-chain type of governance mechanism that will give power to them. And of course, they are the main stakeholders, so they are the most easily identifiable one. But if the decision that they are taking is actually affecting other people, then those people also need to be heard, because like mostly like the user, which we hardly ever hear about them. And I think that it's interesting too, because the one out of the important challenge that the blockchain has, especially like public pseudonymous blockchain, is that we cannot rely on this traditional governance structure that we are using in many countries, which is democracy, because we cannot really give one person, one vote. And
well, Gun might have a couple things to say about that, actually.
Sure. So if we do identify, like, without a strong identity system, it's very difficult to have one person, one vote. So either you need to find a way to make, either you need to rely on a centralized identity system, which in that case can create some issues, or you need to identify a decentralized identity system, which at the moment is very difficult to achieve.
So actually, let's just talk about that, and then I would like to get into some of the recent innovations that Tezos has had. But actually, that's one of the things that Avalanche has, well, I guess certainly in their position papers have talked a little bit about, which is there's some sort of way of essentially assigning one person, one vote, or thereabout.
Approximating it, that's right. So it's very difficult, as Primavera said, to actually achieve one person, one vote. And I don't know that it's actually fully desirable to get to that level. And I certainly don't have a technique that guarantees that. But we have mechanisms in place in Avalanche that we are thinking of deploying, or at least experimenting with, whereby we extract from the crowd some notion of identity on a voluntary basis, and then mediate the amount of power people have, not solely by the amount of tokens they hold, but by identity. So that means that somebody who's a whale doesn't get to come in and just power over all the other users. Doing this is actually kind of non-trivial, I should say, and it's not set in stone that we're going to do this, but we've been experimenting with various different techniques for doing so, and our hearts are certainly in that direction. That is, if this can be made to work, we will definitely push on this direction.
So Arthur, you know, you want to respond directly?
Sorry, this is a fascinating topic, the one person, one vote thing. A couple of comments. The first of all is that the whole one person, one vote thing, I think people think about that when they're thinking about picking values, right? If you want to say, like, you know, what matters? You know, what are we really trying to achieve? Then intuitively, you want to give one person, one vote. You don't want to weigh that with funds. But I don't think that governance should really be about values. I think the values of a project are probably the most immutable part of the project. What you should have governance about is how is making the actual decisions in order to enact those values. And once you look at it this way, it's a lot less important to have one person, one vote, because you're trying to achieve something a lot more objective. The second thing is that one way of having something that's closer to one person, one vote is to just have a very large supermajority threshold. So in Tezos for a vote, for example, the majority threshold is 80%.
That is to say there's a quorum has to be 80%, correct?
There's
so
a quorum, but also the yes must be 80% more than the no's. And so if you have 80% of the tokens, that's not 80% of the people, but it's still going to be a big chunk of the people. So you know at least that there's a lot of people who are in favor of this. So just by having large threshold, and the reason you can do that and not have too many false negatives is that I think that most proposals in terms of governance, the ones which are good are in some sense obviously good, and the ones which are bad are going to be bad in subtle ways. And so one free lunch in this asymmetry is having as many filters as you can, because it's very I think a good proposal will make it through all these filters. They will make it through 80% quorums. They will make it through 80% supermajorities, whereas bad ones will be caught only by certain filters.
Well, that's assuming people are going to vote in the first place. We've seen for instance, in the real world, let's call it, voter participation rates in some countries are at all-time lows. Certainly, direct democracy itself, there are so many things to vote on that eventually becomes impossible to do it, which is why we have created delegate forms of government and essentially done these types of, let's call it, more sophisticated government types over time. But with Tezos, for instance, and this is another thing that I think that the audience really needs to understand, there are a lot of variables and things that can be changed at the protocol level. Would you actually mind spending a few minutes telling the audience about what could conceivably be changed by stakeholders in Tezos?
Yeah, so pretty much at this point, pretty much everything, including the ability to change everything. That's something that can be changed. Right now, you can change everything. The target of what can be changed is made as narrow as possible, in a sense that you only want to make governance decisions about the type of things you need to make governance decisions about. And in general, it's a good idea to maximize the type of things where you don't have to make decisions about. So for example, as Primavera is saying, anything that you have in layer 2s, or if you can have something like sidechains, anytime you can have people basically say, I'm going to do my own thing, you're going to do my own thing. By all means, this is the type of things you want to maximize. But anything that has to do with basically consensus, like everyone, they're part of the system that everyone need to agree upon. So you need to delineate that very, very precisely. This is what people have to agree about. Do people have to agree about the way messages are sent on a network? They don't. They really need to agree on basically the transition between one state and another of the system. And so in Tezos, that can be changed. And that contains a whole lot. That contains your whole governance procedure. So you could decide that, you know what, this governance procedure has too much power. We want to restrict it. We don't want to make decisions, for example, about issuing new tokens. You can do that. You can say, we only want to do soft forks, like Bitcoin, so you can do that. So in a sense, if you think that governance is a bad idea, well, it's actually a more generic form of not having any on-chain governance, because you can choose to restrict it if you want to.
So actually, let's talk about that for a second. What is on-chain governance versus off-chain governance?
So the idea of and I think sometimes it's framed in on-chain governance versus off-chain governance. It's not necessarily the right framing, but the idea is that in off-chain governance, you have a bunch of people and they discuss online and they agree on something. And when they get what is called rough consensus, they roughly agree on what is to be done, then they implement it. And that can take the form of a soft fork, or that can take the form of a hard fork. Whereas the idea of on-chain governance is that this decision happens on the chain. So you reflect a decision on the chain, and then the blockchain automatically upgrades. And I would say that there are projects which say that they do on-chain governance because they do reflect the decision on-chain, but they still rely on the manual user process. And so a better frame for it is, I would say, how tightly coupled you are to your decision. In some cases, you'll have something happen on-chain, but it's only indicative. In other cases, it can be binding. And so what's specific about Tezos is that on-chain governance decisions are binding.
Primavera?
Yeah, first of all, I wanted to say that I think the distinction on-chain, off-chain, like the terminology is terrible, but I think there is another thing that is distinguishing it, and this goes back to the original question of what is governance, is that governance is not just about the process of making a decision, it's also about the process of making sense of the information and deliberation so that people can eventually come to a decision. And on-chain governance is actually only very selectively focusing on the decision-making process, as opposed to all the sense-making or all the deliberation, which actually happen off-chain. And whatever happen off-chain eventually gets committed into the blockchain.
So more or less, it's the vote versus the deliberation before the vote.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I think that most of the time when we talk about on-chain governance, we just assimilate it to governance, but it's actually just the very narrow aspect, which is where, how do we actually show what decision we have taken, as opposed to what is the mechanism by which we come to a decision.
I completely agree. It's a ratification mechanism. You've already made your decision, and it's a way of telling the blockchain, okay, hey, blockchain, we've had this whole governance within ourselves, and this is what we've agreed upon, and you show that on a chain.
So, Gun, I would like to give you a chance to respond, and then I do have to ask one major question before time runs out.
So I don't have anything to add to the insightful commentary right now. I was going to just point out one small difference between the AVA approach to governance and the Tezos approach. The Tezos approach, as Arthur explained, is strictly more powerful. So in AVA, we don't have a mechanism for changing everything under the sky. In fact, we believe that the technology should be predictable. You should know what can change. You should know by how much it can change. and you should know what cannot change. That there should be some values that are endemic to the coin, and some values that are sort of, I think in between the sessions there are, it says fraternité, égalité, etc., liberté. These are the values that actually define this place. That's France, right? That's sort of endemic to this place. And so the coins are similarly structured. And so there should be things that you should rest assured are not going to change. You should be able to step away from the computer knowing that nothing, the sky won't change on you, the world will not change on you. And, and things that are governable, you should know by how much they can move so that you know by how much you can time your absence from the computer. Now, I know that Tezos can emulate this or can actually enact this, but so we chose not to actually go down the path of trying to make everything governable. I think that's a fine path. I think Tezos should be exploring that, and plus coupled with their machine parsable, machine analyzable code, they have some interesting avenues to explore down that road. We're exploring a different road that I think is a little simpler to both implement and to understand, and is hopefully going to lead us to an interesting location.
If only all governments had this type of diplomatic way of disagreeing with each other.
Oh, we're not even disagreeing.
Well, not disagree. Taking different approaches. See, they can't even disagree about that.
And I think it's like if I project myself, like let's say 20 years from now, I would imagine that almost nothing, maybe 20, 30 years from now, almost nothing in Tezos is governable. It's like there's a trade-off between predictability and flexibility. And I think
they'll turn that off over time.
Yeah, exactly, progressively, because early on there's a lot of innovation and you want to be very flexible, you want to adapt, and then at some point, the academics are going to run out of ideas on how to make the systems much better, and at this point you said, okay, that's pretty much it. That's how you design a cryptocurrency or a blockchain. Now we know how to do it, and at that point you really want to start turning these things off.
Okay, so I've got to ask a question about my favorite topic, DAOs. So I know that's a much bigger conversation than 2 minutes and 21 seconds, but I've got to ask, and I'm going to ask a kind of a simple form of this. What is the best, and I know that word means a lot, implementation of a DAO thus far? Jenna, starting with you.
The best implementation of a DAO
thus far.
Okay, the first thing that comes in mind, maybe a little bit biased, Aragon is a framework on Ethereum that is extremely sophisticated in helping people create and manage DAOs. It's still very early as well, but you have, so I have experimented with that myself for the Melon Council tools that we could use for our own processes, and it's really like we have this kind of like Swiss association that has rules, and we literally can take them and put them in an Aragon DAO, and that's how it's going to work. So that's on Ethereum, and I think that's the one that I have tried myself that I think is quite advanced.
Goon, could you answer quickly or no?
Sure. The DAO. The DAO is fantastic in showing everything that can go wrong. And so it's been illustrative. It taught us so much. And the problems with the DAO have still not been solved as far as I know. Don't seem easy to solve in the next couple of years. So I think that's the cake.
And when that happened, there was that big time exit with the hard fork in Ethereum Classic. Primavera?
Yeah, so I'm also quite keen of the DAO just for like all the governance issues that it has brought into light. So I love this experimentation. To answer more presently, I'm just going to sell my product as well, I guess. So I think one of the most interesting projects at the moment is DAOstack, because it's actually like the idea with DAOstack is really to look at these two facets of governance. And the question is, if you create a DAO, you just have exactly the same question of how do you govern the DAO? So either you do it in a centralized way or you do it in a decentralized way, and then you have things like this that happen. And most of the time it's anyhow in a very plutocratic way, which is just what, one token, one vote. So DAOstack is trying to innovate in this sense by looking at also the sense-making aspect of things. And so it's separating the governance into sense-making and decision-making using, basically the problem is how do you scale when you actually want to have like thousands of people that needs to involve into the governance of a DAO, how do you get everyone to pay attention to everything? It's pretty much impossible.
It's hard to do.
It's hard to do.
Arthur?
Just one word because you're running out of time. Tezos.
There we go. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.